zoo animal Christian. And what he meant by that was don't be content to sit in your cage and just have scraps thrown to you. So don't settle for just coming to church and having a few verses of scripture thrown your way. There's a whole Christian life out there to live. You're free to roam. So get out of where you're comfortable. I think that's what we were just singing. That's what we've been talking about. So we're spending a few weeks here at Kingfisher. If you've been around, you will know this very well, looking at what it means to get into the stretch zone. Can everybody stretch? You look good. You can benefit from the stretch. So we've been looking at what it means to get out of where we feel most comfortable into that place where God can actually grow us and develop us into the people that he wants us to be and to do the things he needs us to do. And we've already thought about why we need to stretch, the need to build resilience and strength for the journey so that we can endure and not give up. And we thought about what that zone might feel like. Sorry to tell you, uncomfortable. Yeah. But that pain can alert us to the things that are wrong in our lives, and it can teach us what we need to do to see real change. Last week was all about how great achievement often emerges from great struggle. Do you remember? If you were here. That we need struggles. Testing situations show up the genuineness or the quality of something. And the Bible is clear that our faith needs testing so that it will endure. So listen, if you want to catch up, you can go to YouTube or you can go to the podcast. They're all there, and I would really recommend that you do. But I want to press the point today a little bit more as we look at the environment for growing great faith. What does it usually look like when God is trying to grow confidence and faith in us regarding who he is, regarding what he can do? So to help us, we're going to look at how Jesus taught his disciples. And you'll find this in Matthew 14, verses 22 to 23. So if you've got a Bible with you or a Bible app, open it right now to Matthew 14. You can read it along with me. Just before this passage is where we read about the feeding of the 5,000. Do you remember that? Jesus has been speaking to this enormous crowd. Actually, it was way more than 5,000. 5,000 was just the men, by the way. So if you include the females and you include the children, they reckon there could be between 10 and 15,000 people in that crowd. And it was getting late, and they were in a remote location, and the disciples of Jesus came to him and said, send the people away so they can go and get something to eat. And Jesus replies with this outrageous statement. He says, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. You give them. This is a crowd of 15,000. There's 12 of them. What are they going to do? Have you ever been in that position where the task in front of you just seems impossible? And the disciples, understandably, they try and make their limitations clear to Jesus. We've only got 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's it. That's it. It's useless. Have you ever tried to explain to God why you can't do something? As if he isn't actually aware of your situation. But Jesus says, just give me what you've got. And rather than complain about it, what Jesus does is he lifts his eyes to heaven and he thanks God for it. And then he starts passing it back to his disciples who give it out. And before you know it, we read that everyone ate and were satisfied. And there were 12 baskets of leftovers. How does that happen? With Jesus. What's he teaching them here? It's like I've been saying every single week of this series. He has the full picture. He knows you better than you know yourself. And when you put into his hands what you think might just be a little, that's actually when the miracle happens. That's when your faith and your confidence in God actually really start to grow. So to build any muscle, you have to exercise it. Is that right? And it will often feel uncomfortable and confusing to start with. That is not a reason to opt out or give up, by the way. So off the back of this faith-growing situation that Jesus has just put his disciples in, he sends them straight into another one. So this is where we read from verse 22. Thank you, Laurie. We're going to make a dramatized reading. I hope you enjoy this, everybody. Immediately he directed, in another version it says, he strongly urged his disciples to get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, while he sent the crowds away. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When it was evening, he was there alone. But the boat, by this time, was already a long distance from land, tossed and battered by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came to them walking on the water. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. And they said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately he spoke to them, saying, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." Peter replied to him, "Lord, if it is really you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, and he walked on the water, and he came toward Jesus. But when he saw the effects of the wind, he was frightened, and he began to sink. And he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus extended his hand and caught him, saying, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got back into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those in the boat worshipped him with awe-inspired reverence, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." We've got to get ourselves in that picture. When we sometimes read things in the Bible, it feels so sanitized. You've got to see what that sea looked like and what that wind sounded like to understand how amazing it was what Peter actually did in that moment. And this is what I want us to get today, that in order to build faith that is strong, we need to be put into environments where that faith can be exercised. You know, according to the NHS website, I know I've been quoting off this a few times, but it says that exercise builds and strengthens muscles, which can protect the bones from injury and support, and protect joints affected by arthritis. Strong muscles also give stability and improve balance and coordination. So, if you want to be spiritually strong, with a faith that lasts, a faith that is stable, a faith that has a confidence in God that grows, it needs exercising. Listen, a strength exercise is any activity that makes your muscles work harder than usual. This increases your muscles' strength, size, power, and endurance. It's not just physically we're talking about here. We're talking spiritually. That's what we want to be, don't we? Pumped up. So here's a question. When was the last time you exercised your faith muscle? When was the last time you trusted and relied on God in an impossible situation? I mean, the problem with our society right now, I think, is that we are so self-sufficient. You know, if we enjoy good health, and we have the security of a good job and a comfortable home, and we've got money in the bank to fall back on, that's when people don't see their need of God. They don't see their need of a Savior. Never mind that it's also temporary, that we don't actually have much control over anything, really. Troubles will come to everybody. They just do. Jesus said it would happen. And when they eventually do, what then? What's your faith going to be based on? Jesus said this in one of his parables. He said that anyone who listens to my teaching and follows it is wise, like a person who builds a house on solid rock. Though the rain comes in torrents and the flood waters rise and the winds beat against that house, it won't collapse because it is built on bedrock. But anyone who hears my teaching and doesn't obey it is foolish, like a person who builds a house on sand. When the rains and floods come, when they come, not if, and the winds beat against that house, it will collapse with a mighty crash. You know, when you're listening to Jesus and you are following him, it doesn't stop the wind from beating against your house. But that wind will show you how strong your foundations are. Be sure of that. In fact, we need the wind to show what our faith is like and to make it stronger. There's a very famous quote by a man called Leonard Hill that says, the strongest oak tree of the forest is not the one that is protected from the storm and hidden from the sun. It's the one that stands in the open where it is compelled to struggle for its existence against the winds and rains and the scorching sun. You know, there was a great experiment done in the 1980s. I remember this. I think it was on Blue Peter. And it was in the desert, and it was called the Biodome. Does anybody remember this? It was an exercise to create the perfect living environment for human beings, for plant life, and for animal life. It was a huge glass dome. It was constructed. It was artificially controlled. It was an environment that was created with purified air, purified water, filtered light, and so on, offering the perfect growing conditions, allegedly. People lived in the biodome for many months at a time, and it was wonderful because everything seemed to do well, with one exception. When the trees that were planted grew to be a certain height, they would simply topple over. It baffled scientists for the longest time, until one day they realized that the one natural element they'd forgotten to recreate in the biodome was wind. Trees need wind to blow against them, which in turn causes their root systems to grow deeper into the soil, which in turn supports the tree as it grows taller. Last week we were talking about the need for our faith to be tested. You won't know how present or genuine your faith really is until it is tested. You won't know how trustworthy God really is until Jesus is all you have to rely on. This is what Peter and the other disciples discovered. I mean, the fact is that Jesus sent his disciples into that stormy environment. Think about that for a moment. And some of them were seasoned fishermen, by the way. They were used to being on the water. This must have been some storm. And he was insistent that they get in the boat and go to the other side of the lake. You know, if Jesus said that's what they would do, just like he had with the food a moment earlier, would they believe him? Would they trust him in it? Would they have confidence that he would get them to the other side? And as Jesus prayed and watched from a distance, notice that they were never out of his sight. This is what he saw. It says, but the boat by this time was already a long distance from land, tossed and battered by the waves, for the wind was against them. I mean, the problem for the disciples in that moment, as far as they could see, was that Jesus wasn't there. Maybe they felt abandoned by him in that moment. And that's often how people talk when they find themselves in a crisis situation. It's like, where's God? But the truth was that Jesus was with them. And when the night was at its darkest and the storm was at its fiercest, it says between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning. Have you noticed that is always the time where you feel the worst if you're not sleeping? They finally realized that he was there. They finally saw him. But relief wasn't their response. Instead, it says that they were terrified and they cried out in fear. Have you noticed that God doesn't often answer our prayers in the way we think he should? Has anybody ever found that? We want him to airlift us out of danger. We want him to stop the storm immediately. We want him to make us feel comfortable. But in the same way that Jesus was trying to train his disciples to become mighty people of faith who would change the world, that is what he wants to do with us too. God's response when we cry out in fear is more often than not to presence himself with us in the midst of that crisis, in the midst of the storm, not remove it from us straight away. Because there are things that he wants to teach us about ourselves. There are things that he wants to teach us about what he is like in those moments, and to encourage us to hold on to him. That's where faith gets exercised, where faith gets built. This is what he wants all of us to hear in those moments and to understand. And we only learn that in this environment. This is what he says. He says, take courage. Take courage. It is I. Another version just says, I am. It was the name of God. I am is here. Do not be afraid. If you want to grow in courage, if you want to truly learn who God is and grow in your knowledge of him and be a fully devoted follower of his, where you get to experience the supernatural life you do, then get used to this environment, because that's where your faith is going to get exercised. We're calling it the stretch zone in this series. If you'll listen to God during these times, when the wind is against you, and determined to keep your eyes on Jesus and do as he says, then it will build real resilience within you. It will. I love the attitude of Simon Peter. He didn't make it easy for himself, did he? He didn't say, Lord, if that's really you, stop the wind and calm the waves, which is much more my prayer in those moments. Do you recognize that? Actually, he shouted, Lord, if it's really you, command me to come to you walking on the water. And Jesus said, come. Or he probably shouted it above the wind. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. I don't know what was going through Peter's mind in that moment. What on earth is he thinking? I don't know whether his faith and his confidence was more in what he thought he could do. But what we see is that within seconds, he got totally distracted with what was going on around him. This is what we read. But when he saw the effects of the wind, he was frightened and he began to sink. And he cried out, Lord, save me. You know, just because God has called you to do something, don't imagine it's going to be easy. Let that sink in for a minute. Because it won't be. But it will always be worth it. You will feel the wind against you, I'm telling you. Opposition will come, and with it, the internal doubts and fears. But will you keep your eyes on Jesus and keep walking anyway? That's the important thing. Despite the wind and the waves, will you obey him when he says, come? My experience is that when God calls you to do something, it always feels uncomfortable. I've never known any different to that. If you could accomplish something easily on your own, in your own strength, then I'd question whether it was from God at all. Because he wants us to learn to trust him. Has called you to do it. Does not make it easy. You know, when Peter stepped out in response to what Jesus said, the wind did not stop. The waves did not calm. Despite the distractions, Peter had to commit to the walk. He couldn't just keep one foot in the boat and the other on the sea. I see many people like that, trying to keep their options open. Have you ever heard of the term FOMO? F-O-M-O? Fear of missing out? So a lot of this goes on the internet when we see everybody else having an amazing time. And we like to keep our options open. We're so fearful of missing out on the next best thing that we won't commit to anything long term. I'll keep my options open. But one foot in the boat and one foot in the sea will just tear you in two. If you hear God calling you and you don't make that move, all in, like Peter had to be, floundering and confused, not going anywhere. Now, Peter made that leap, but suddenly it felt all too uncomfortable, and scary. And as Jesus reached out and caught him, he said, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" In the notes, if you read the Amplified version, it explains that word doubt. It says trying to go in two different directions, which makes me think that when Peter started walking, he got scared and he tried to make it back to the boat. He was trying to go in two different directions. You can't do that. And he just sank. You can't be obedient to Jesus whilst looking at everything else around you or back at where you've come from. Like it says in the book of James, it says, if you need wisdom, ask our generous God, and he will give it to you. He will not rebuke you for asking. But when you ask him, be sure that your faith is in God alone. Do not waver. For a person with divided loyalty is as unsettled as a wave of the sea that is blown and tossed by the wind. Such people should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. So ask, hear, obey. The strength of the wind coming against me is not the measure I use as to whether I've heard God right. But as I keep my eyes on Jesus and I keep walking toward him anyway, then my faith will keep growing. In another translation, it says this of Peter. It says that when he perceived and felt the strong wind, he was frightened. And that's so often the case with us. No, it is with me. We allow our feelings, we allow our own perceptions to direct us. That was dangerous for Peter, and it's dangerous for us. We need to feel the wind, but keep listening to God's voice and trusting him. That will keep us going rather than just sinking. You know, there are so many stories in the Bible to inspire us in this way. No one got away with it easy in the Bible, did they? Take Daniel. Huge opposition against him because he was worshiping God. And it was because of his faith, and it resulted in him being thrown into the lion's den. You know the story really well. His faith in God and God's plan enabled him to keep trusting those circumstances couldn't look any worse. And he saw an amazing victory. He didn't get eaten. Many see the impact of their faith in their lifetime. They see how God has used them when they hold on to him and keep going. Whether you see the end result or not, that's not the point. You know, Hebrews 11, if you go read there, it's a chapter all about great examples of faith. It describes the lives of those many who were taken. They trusted God, but they didn't see in their lifetime what their faith would accomplish. How tough is that? You know, a modern day example of this was a man many of you might know called Jim Elliot, famous missionary. He was obedient to God's call to go and reach a specific tribe of people in Ecuador. And this was dangerous territory. And he was killed by the very tribe he was trying to share God's love with. And you think, well, what was all that about? Did he hear wrong? Surely that wasn't God's will for Jim's life to be cut so short. But what Jim started, what he sowed, eventually led to that whole tribe being transformed as they came to know Jesus. I mean, was that a price worth paying? Well, if like Jim Elliot, you have an eternal perspective and you want your life to count in eternity, then most certainly it was. You know, in parts of the world today where persecution is at its fiercest and people are being imprisoned and killed for their faith, actually more today than at any other time in history. But that is actually where you will find people with the strongest faith. That's where you'll find people whose roots are actually deep in God, where their conviction is greater than those of us who never feel the wind. You know, Jim Elliot said, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose." I mean, he lived with the belief that God always gives his best to those who leave the choice with him. And his encouragement to other people was this. He said, wherever you are, be all there. Wherever you are, be all there. In other words, commit to that walk on water. Determined to be fully devoted to Jesus. Don't allow the wind and the waves to distract you from where he is calling you. And don't look back to the comfort of the boat, much as we all want to. When Jesus finally got into the boat with Peter, only then did the wind stop. He had to walk Peter all the way back through that wind and waves. And this is what we now read. And this is what that whole experience, that environment taught the disciples. It says, then those in the boat worshipped him with awe-inspired reverence, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. I mean, their response was one of worship, as they had a revelation in that environment of who Jesus was. And that's what the environment of the stretch zone can do for you and me, as we look to Jesus when we feel that wind coming against us. Just being with Jesus didn't change much for the disciples. They needed to learn to trust him. And it's the same for us. Just coming to church on a Sunday won't change very much. You know, a fair weather Christian won't achieve very much in kingdom terms. But God is still looking for those who will be all in. Those willing to risk it all for him. Those who will feel the wind and keep walking anyway. People like Jim, people like Peter. People of faith, faithful. And that's what I loved yesterday about this whole Believers in Recovery conference. The theme of the day was legacy of faith. And they were teaching us about how we can get our faith built up. Faith-filled to be faithful. You need both. You need to be filled up, and then you can be faithful. What does it mean to be faithful? It means to be reliable. It means to be available. It means to be teachable. You know, for all his faults and mistakes, it was Peter, Simon Peter, who Jesus said, your name is Peter, which means rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. Peter, who at least he gave it a go. He was all in. And he got it wrong at times, like we all do. But it was that sense of, Jesus, I'm for you, and I want everything that you've got for me. And it was upon Peter that Jesus said he would build his church. You know, in Jesus' day, there were many people who followed him, who called themselves his disciples, but not everybody responded well to some of the challenging things that he said. Not everyone was willing to pay the price. So that we read in the Gospel of John in chapter 6, it says that at this point, many of his disciples turned away and deserted him. You know, people still do today. When they don't like what it is that God is doing, or they don't like what he's saying, they're not willing to pay the price, and they walk away. And they miss out on so much that God has got for them. Then Jesus turned to the 12 and said, are you also going to leave? And Simon Peter replied, Lord, to whom would we go? You have the words that give eternal life. We believe and we know you are the Holy One of God. They didn't just go to Jesus just to listen to him like those vast crowds. They were with him. They saw him in the storm. They were with him in those moments that built their faith. God is still working his salvation purposes out on the earth, by the way. I mean, yesterday for me was such evidence of that. These amazing testimonies of people who have had the worst backgrounds you can imagine, who have come to faith in Jesus and are going for it in ways that put me to shame, I have to say. I felt convicted yesterday. Reduced me to tears a number of times yesterday, just listening to stories of God's transforming power in people's lives. God is still working his salvation purposes out. Jesus has already done the hardest part. That's the best of it for you and me, when he died for you and me. When the wind came against him, when the crowds came to arrest him, when the religious leaders falsely accused him, when the soldiers beat him, and when he was nailed to a tree, he kept his gaze on the joy that was set before him. And at the age of 33, he gave his life for you and for me, so that we could get to the other side. You know, no storm was going to stop what Jesus had told his disciples they would do. If Jesus said it, then it will be so. So will you trust him to get you to the other side, despite the storms that are sure to come your way? There's a repeated phrase in Hebrews 11 which says, it was by faith that Moses, it was by faith that Noah, it was by faith that these people did these amazing things. It was by faith. So here's the questions that I want to leave you with this morning. What are you doing by faith? What are you doing that you cannot do without God stepping in and helping you? What are you doing by faith? Where is your faith taking you? Will you see the stretch zone as that place where you can be filled with faith to become faithful in order to put that faith to work? That's what I want to see. Why don't we stand together? Father, Lord, thank you. Thank you that you have been faithful to me. Thank you that your faithfulness reaches. Thank you that your faithfulness lasts. Thank you that you do not give up on us. And Lord, I want to be faith-filled to be faithful to your calling on my life. I don't want to miss out. I don't want to be distracted by other things. I don't want to be distracted by my own internal doubts and fears. Lord, I want to hear your voice and go for it, no matter what wind comes against me. So, Lord, would you just help us to see when we get into a storm, Lord, that it could be for our benefit. Lord, help us to keep our eyes on you in those moments. Help us to reach out to you. Help us to hold on to you. Help us to have our faith really built up in you. Lord, that we would hear when we get to heaven that, well done, good and faithful servant. Lord, that's what I want to hear. So, Lord, would you come and do whatever you need to do in me? Lord, that I might be all in for you. And it may be that you're here at church this morning and you don't even have a relationship with God. Or maybe you did a long time ago and somewhere along the line you just got distracted. And Jesus is saying the same thing to you this morning. If you're calling out, are you really there? Is it really you? He's saying, come. Get out of the boat. Move towards me. I can lift you up. I'm not going to let you sink. And you just need to call on his name, like Peter. Lord, thank you that you always answer that earnest call for help. Thank you for your constant presence.